Hello, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Dale Willman. I'm the Associate Director of the Resilience Media Project at Columbia University's Earth Institute. Today's event is bringing together researchers who work on land use models in Central America. Growing evidence suggests that when indigenous and local communities are included in land use decisions, they can be strong partners in protecting land, particularly in tropical forests. Keeping these forests intact is vital in addressing climate change. We'll focus today on one example of effective land use practice from Guatemala. We will be discussing research that shows how the goals of economic development, conservation, and physical security can be met by local communities in tropical forest countries. And this can happen despite threats from wildfires, illegal logging, or invasions by drug cartels. This particular area is in the northern corner of Guatemala's Maya Biosphere Reserve, an area known as the Peten. 9 local communities were first granted concessions to their forests in that region in 1997. Those concessions are now up for extension, but there is a challenge in the form of legislation in the U.S. Senate. This legislation would support an alternative development model that is tourist-focused. Under this alternate model, the land concessions would be removed from local control. As this fight over control of the land continues, the current concessions remain a global magnet for political leaders, local communities, and researchers who are looking for sustainable, community-led solutions for stopping the destruction of tropical forests in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. We have 4 speakers today. I'll introduce them in the order in which they'll be talking. Andrew Davis is a researcher at the Prisma Foundation, an environment and development research center based in El Salvador. His research focuses on forest governance, traditional community land management, and their impacts on biodiversity and forest conservation. Ileana Monterroso is a scientist and coordinator of gender and social inclusion research with the Center of International Forestry Research at CIFOR. Ileana has studied the process of community forest management in the Peten for more than 20 years. Beth Tellman is a human environmental geographer and researcher at Columbia University's Earth Institute. She's also co-author of a recent peer-reviewed study entitled Illicit Drivers of Land Use Change, Narcotrafficking and Forest Loss in Central America. And Francisco Estrada Bele specializes in Maya archaeology, remote sensing, and geographic information systems. He's got a great article on that in National Geographic. He's a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries of London and a National Geographic Explorer. We'll have time for questions following the speaker remarks. If you have a question during the briefing, please enter it in the Zoom chat addressed to all participants. I'd like you to enter your name, your media outlet, the question, and most importantly, the speaker you'd like to address the question to. And we'll hope to cover as many questions as possible. Just a note that participants will be muted during this briefing. And with that, I'll hand it over to Andrew Davis. Andrew, please go ahead.
Good morning,
don't forget to unmute. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to share with you some of the work that the Prisma Foundation has done around forest fires and looking at different management regimes, management models, and how they perform in different contexts of forest fires. We've all seen in recent years the increasing threat of forest fires, not only in landscapes that have traditionally seen forest fires in places like Australia, California, and Europe, but increasingly also in tropical landscapes, including humid tropical forests. So what I'm going to present today is some research that comes from Guatemala. There was a recent government report that has come out on this season of forest fires, which was again a year of crisis forest fires, which triggered an emergency response in the country. Here you can see the map of hotspots in the Peten, where over 10,000 hotspots were detected this year, and over 39,000 hectares of forest were affected in the entire department. 99% of these fires were actually inside protected areas, demonstrating how ineffective protected areas were generally in response to forest fires. The most effective management model inside the Peten were the community concessions. As we've heard, these are community concessions which came together in the 1990s around the idea of managing forests sustainably. You can see them here in the circle in the upper right part of the map. These communities actually are quite remarkable, not only for their success in fighting fires, but also because they come from a very mixed history. They're indigenous people, they're farmer communities, many of which were displaced during the brutal civil war, which ended in 1996. And they came together as part of the agreement of the peace accords in Guatemala to form these concessions and manage these forests sustainably, which makes the story even more remarkable. The success of the community concession model we saw this year is consistent with the entire history of the community concessions over the past 20 years. The map you see here is from a study done in 2017. You can see the community concessions in dark green. And so it's important for us to look at what are the keys of success for this model. First is that land rights through the concession gives incentives for sustainability. These rights also help communities and governments cooperate on forest fires. It provides the framework for collaboration in many scenarios where communities are not part of the strategy. And finally, investment in sustainable community businesses provides resources to prevent forest fires, in this case, community forest enterprises. These community forest enterprises have generated the resources available to invest approximately $5 million over the past 10 years, which is the bulk of investment in preventing and controlling forest fires in this region. And these resources have gone to clearing vegetation, to patrolling fire breaks, roads, and rivers using patrol towers, as well as integrated monitoring systems which use satellite, drone, and on-the-ground activity. The Prisma Foundation, along with many other organizations, have been working along with the community concessions to try and help the world learn the lessons of how this model works and how it might be replicated in other parts of the world. Policymakers and communities have come from places like Brazil, Indonesia, Panama, Honduras, and many others. Most recently in Colombia, where Colombia is facing a post-conflict scenario that shares many characteristics similar to the context in which the community concessions emerged in the 1990s. That has led to new forest programs that have been inspired by the community concessions to build sustainable development in the context of post-conflict in Colombia. So we're going to hear later about the pressures over the community concessions, not just from fires. So we really are at a critical juncture for supporting these concessions, not only for Guatemala, but for their importance for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ileana Monteroso, please.
Thank you, Dale. Good morning, everybody. And just to share part of our research, over the last 2 decades around the world, research suggests that local communities that achieve stronger legal rights over their forests and other natural resources are able to access investments and deliver on the goals of sustainable development. The creation of the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala almost 25 years ago represents a switch in the Guatemalan government policy regarding not only land use, but also land tenure, setting aside 75% of the Peten region for protection. This is the largest protected area in the country, as well as the largest portion of the Mayan forest, including Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize. This meant a move from a focus on agriculture, putting conservation outcomes at the center of the process, which has resulted in one of the largest certified forests managed collectively by communities. And what has this accomplished? Research from our partners, World Agroforestry and Rainforest Alliance, shows that local communities have attracted new forms of private investment with improvements in their technical abilities. They have been able to establish community forest enterprises, allowing them to diversify their activities and derive economic and environmental benefits. And what are the numbers telling us? Since these concession contracts have been signed, more than $2 million in taxes have been paid to the Guatemalan government. Timber and non-timber forest products generate over $5 million per year from sales and transformations. And this does not account for the employment opportunities. Forest management is the most important source of income, representing up to 40%, in some of these communities, 60% of family incomes. This is a large comparison in comparison to remittances and even tourism activities. Community forest enterprises have also acquired physical assets valued over $5 million. And the deforestation rates is almost zero, as you have shared from my colleague before. So in terms of migration, human mobility continues to be a major issue in this frontier area, where about 40,000 people have been reported to cross this border annually by ACNUR. In Peten, we know by government data that human mobility is taking place internally. But finally, this is very important given now how the community forests have been portrayed in some accounts. We found that among families covered by the community concessions, only 2% have reported to receive remittances. As you will hear from us today, the overarching conclusion, and one that has attracted global attention, is that community forest enterprises of Guatemala Biosphere Reserve have helped the communities to solve social, economic, and governance challenges that neither the state nor the market has proved capable of addressing. This represents a win-win for all, but particularly for the government of Guatemala. Not only do these communities pay taxes, they also generate employment opportunities and contribute to public services, including health, education, and firefighting activities in areas where government institutions are mostly absent. So in fact, the concessions have been so successful in combating fires and strengthening governance of the areas against illicit activities, they have become an important ally for government institutions managing the protected area, which occasionally ask for their help. Along the border, the concessions share with government managed lands. Thanks.
Thank you. A question. So I live on the edge of a 6 million acre park in upstate New York. So I'm very familiar with the tourist-based economy because that's the strong economic driver in that region. And tourist-based jobs are typically seasonal and low paid. How does that compare to the wages, the income in this landholding?
Mm-hmm.
So how does that compare to the wages?
Our research has shown that, so in case of the wages and the income, I mean, the income is not only coming from the wages, but also from dividends that are shared after the timber and non-timber forest product sales. In the case of these families, some of these families have reported that up to 60% of their family income is coming from forest activities. 40% is the average. This compares to only 1%, less than 1% in some of these communities that actually are relying on tourism, and varies across these 9 different concessions. So it's very low in comparison to what these communities are earning from forests.
But this 40 to 60% of family income, is it a living wage? Is it something that can support these families well?
Yes, actually, our research is showing that this income, it's where the communities are able to reinvest, especially in health, in education, and some of this investment at the community forest enterprise are being done on actually controlling forest fires and patrolling borders. For instance, the data that Prisma and Andrew showed previously has accounted for almost $500,000 that community forest enterprises are investing in managing fires every year. This is money that the government is not investing. We're also calculated how much is the government paying for controlling some of these areas. And we have accounted that between a period of 5 years, the government of Guatemala has invested more than $1.5 million to control an area that only represents 4% of the Mayan Biosphere Reserve. This is a very high price at cost that the Guatemalan government is not paying in these areas that are being managed by community forest enterprises.
Juliana, thank you. Now, if we could go on to Beth Tillman. Beth, please.
Great, thanks so much. Before I talk about discussions that our research group has found concerning the importance and the role of local communities in mitigating illegal cattle ranching, often propagated by drug cartels, I want to mention the role of U.S. government policy in the war on drugs that's creating the conditions fueling deforestation in protected areas throughout Central America. Narco-deforestation in the Mayan biosphere is a product of the U.S.-led war on drugs and militarized interdiction that fails to address the demand for cocaine in North America and Europe. This pushes traffickers into increasingly remote areas that are also home to Central America's remaining forest. An estimated 86% of cocaine reaches the U.S. by moving through Central America. adding $6 billion in annual profits, despite the failed efforts of the United States government to intercept cocaine shipments. Only about 7% of cocaine is actually removed by current interdiction policies. So we know that it's ineffective, it's not working, it's not mitigating the volume of cocaine coming to the US, it's not affecting cocaine prices, but it is affecting people, communities, and forests in Central America. Studies that we've done, one that was released last year in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, for example, has shown that the reason narco-trafficking is so widespread and difficult to eradicate is because interdiction continues to spread traffickers into new areas. And we've seen the impact of that on Central America's forest. We've been using satellite data, news media, and official drug trafficking data to track the movement of both drugs and deforestation. And what we found is that new patterns of anomalous, rapid, and large clearings are appearing for the first time as drugs have moved through Central America. Up to 30% of forest loss is now related to these large anomalous patterns. Up to 60% of forest loss, however, in protected areas is related to these large patterns that we've shown are correlated with drug trafficking. Why is this happening? Because of accumulated narco capital. Narco traffickers launder money, often through cattle ranching and accumulating land in these territories. Cattle can be used to traffic cocaine. They can also be moved illegally across borders, sold in Mexico, and the falsified receipts can then be used to clean and deposit money into bank accounts. We've seen this really concentrated in the eastern part of the Mayo Biosphere Reserve, outside of the community concessions, where Jennifer Devine's research recently published in Land Use Policy shows that 60 to 80% of aerial photos of deforestation in this region exhibit evidence of illegal cattle ranching that we've shown through other studies is linked to narco trafficking. The other thing that we found looking at different models of conservation governance, community governance, and indigenous land management is that community forest programs like aquafopes are more resilient to narco land grabs. It's so much easier to pay off a few guards in remote protected areas that are not well governed than in places where there are peopled forests, where local communities have a stake in keeping the forest standing. Models like aquafopes are effective at protecting forests and protecting sustainable economic development. So we know that investing in community organization, rights, concessions, and the right for sustainable extraction is essential in protecting forests amid this larger context of narco trafficking. Conservation of policy and reforming US interdiction and drug policy must work together to protect forests and communities in Central America.
I understand why I get the idea of people being in the forest, but what's the mechanism that's preventing narco operations from coming in, though? Just having people in the forest is enough to stop them from doing this?
Yeah, well, we can't interview narco traffickers in our research, so this comes from based on talking to communities about what's effective. We have an article on conservation governance and illicit narco trafficking published in Global Environmental Change last month that kind of details interviews with community members. And what we found is that that narco traffickers seek places that are as remote as possible, where there's going to be a lot less resistance to their incursion, where their activities might not be reported or are going to be a lot less visible. So the simple impact of having people present, an active and peaceful presence in forest is important, but they also need land for operations. And so they're looking for places where people aren't currently active in sustainable extraction.
There's the broken window theory from years ago that came out of Chicago, and the idea that the presence of people walking on streets and being very visible helps reduce crime simply because of that. So I guess that's kind of a similar mechanism you're talking about there.
Yeah, but it's not just having people around to see what's going on. I think it's also about having people invested in conserving land. So community forest concessions is not just having people on the forest, but the fact that they have an incentive to preserve the forest because that's their sustainable economic development is an additional incentive to protect those lands and report activities like illegal cattle ranching that could influence their own economic development. So it provides a much stronger incentive.
Okay, thank you.
Extraction.
And our last speaker, Francisco Stradabelli, if you would please.
Thank you. So thank you for having me. So I started working in the Maya biosphere as an archaeologist 20 years ago. So I've been able to witness their success in not only preventing fires in the area under their control, but also in preventing further looting. This is an area of 21,000 square kilometers, extremely large, and community concessions control about 25% of it. And in this area, there are hundreds of archaeological sites, some of them extremely important in terms of the role they play, at least for archaeology, in telling the story of Maya civilization, a civilization that emerged in this area about 1000 BC and continued uninterrupted until the arrival of the Spanish, 500 years ago. And in this area, there are cities that flourished at different times. Some of them belong to the classic period between 300 AD and 900 AD. And some of them are very well known and visited as tourist attractions, like Tikal. It's actually one of the most visited sites in Guatemala, if not the most visited site in Guatemala. And then other cities belong to the previous era of pre-classic Maya civilization. We have cities that belong to this period from 300 BC all the way to the 1st century AD. And these tend to be more remote and less known. And one of these cities has been in the news quite often, even though we don't know much about it. It's the city of El Mirador and belongs to this pre-classic era, is located in one of the most remote areas of the biosphere in the Mirador Rio Azul National Park, which is not only remote, but is surrounded by these community concessions that have created a very effective buffer to prevent invasion and deforestation, as well as archaeological looting to that site and other sites around it. And I personally have witnessed how, in my area, which is in one of the, actually has 4 community concession managing this area. There's been absolutely no looting, archaeological looting, since the concessions were first created in the late 90s. In terms of the significance of these sites, there's been also some misinformation and some confusion in terms of how they what is their place within Maya archaeology and Maya culture. For example, there's been some exaggeration about El Mirador, said to be the largest, the oldest, having the largest pyramid in the world. And at the same time, there's been confusion about where it is located, how accessible it is, and the protection that has been afforded by the community concessions around it. And so, I guess I can say that a lot of the information about this site has been exaggerated, and it has been designed to promote this novel idea of creating a new park that would remove the community concessions from the very center of the biosphere and promote a privatization scheme by creating a tourist attraction, including even a train to these archaeological sites that would be basically breaking all the rules in conservation that they've been set when the biosphere was created, and they've been supported by U.S. Development agencies and European developing agencies for about 20 years, with the great cost of taxpayer money. And so my testimony is that Mirador and some of the sites located in these most remote areas are probably the ones that have the least amount of risk in terms of all the threats from cattle ranching, forest fires, and looting. And that's because they've been protected by the community forest concession.
Francisco, here's what puzzles me, and this comes from my experience up here at the Adirondacks, and I've spent a lot of time looking into the friction between local ownership and state ownership. It's a state park, and this seems to be cast as an either/or. Either it's land concessions or it's a big tourist facility. Are these in conflict? Is it not possible to have a land concession but also tourist activity for a site of such significance?
Yes, in fact, that is contemplated within the master plan of the biosphere, and there are community-based tourist operators that take tourists to Mirador and other remote sites, but it's very low impact. But also, it's very, the profit margins are very small. And so one of the threats that we see to the current model is this, big investors wanting to bring in, big investments and, more developments and create, greater profits. But, the question is those profits, how much of those profits would really go to the local communities that are actually doing all the work of protecting the sites and the forest.
And this is a problem in many countries, the idea of privatizing profits and removing them out of the country, keeping the problems created by such a situation as a local problem. Is that something that you see occurring if the land concessions are removed? Is this an issue that potentially, how would a shift in this affect the local communities, I guess, is what I'm really trying to get at?
Well, from an economic standpoint, it would be disastrous because right now the local communities have a real stake in the local economy. They control their work and their resources. Whereas if these rights were to be removed and big tourist operations would take over and presumably hire all the locals as low-wage laborers, it would be a very different situation. Not to mention the benefits that these concessions create in terms of creating community organization, and as some of my colleagues have mentioned, they also replace the infrastructure that the state is responsible. They create clinics and they build schools. So they're really doing the work of the state where the state is not present. And so that would be completely, gone if the land rights were to be removed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our speakers for these opening remarks. We'll take questions from the journalists who are watching now. If you have a question, again, please enter it in the Zoom chat. Enter your name, your media outlet, and the question, and to whom you are directing your question to. So if you could start entering your questions, that'd be great. We have a couple that were submitted earlier. So the first question comes from Andrea Sosa at Deutsche Press. What is the current status of the legislation at the U.S. Senate? And Andrew, that would go toward you. So do you know the current status of the legislation in the U.S.?
Yes, my understanding is that the bill has been referred to the Foreign Affairs Committee, and it has not progressed since being referred there. There are conservation organizations, a number of conservation organizations that are opposing the bill because of the success of the community concessions, the importance of keeping them intact, and they are watching that process closely. But I understand that it has not moved forward since being moved to Foreign Affairs.
And that was how long ago? That was recently, or?
Recently, yes, within the last month.
Okay. And there's a second part to her question, which is, what has been the Guatemalan government's position to it? And Ileana, if I could ask you to respond to that, the Guatemalan government's response to this legislation in the U.S.
Thank you, Dale. Actually, I think the link to the Guatemalan government's position was shared with you in the chat. As you will see, on June 28, the Guatemalan government issued a communication release confirming their commitment not only to conservation and to the Mayan Biosphere Reserve, but also recognize the benefits and the contributions of the community forest concession model, which is actually unprecedented. This was a combined position from the National Council of Protected Areas, the Ministry of Culture, which is the one that runs and manages all of the archaeological sites, and this was published by the Foreign Affairs Ministry. And so this is quite important, especially because of the political, as you have heard from my colleagues, but also a political economic interest behind this area and region.
All right, thank you. So, you know, nothing, I don't know which one of you to address this to, and a couple of you may want to jump in, but nothing's perfect. So what are the downsides of these land concessions? What have we learned over 20 years that could be adjusted or changed to make them better? And again, I'm relating this to what happens, you know, currently in the Adirondacks and the difficulty they have with a tourist-based economy here and the difficulty in creating new enterprises that would pay better wages. And so it's infrastructure needs, in particular in the Adirondacks, it's internet, it's other sorts of things, access to things that would help them expand. What are the difficulties in a land concession such as this? And what have we learned over 20 years that might make something better? Who wants to, anybody want to try and, Andrew, please.
I'll jump in on that. I think one of the key lessons from this process is that 25-year concessions are actually pretty weak in terms of rights. And one of the main lessons has been that the 25-year concession model maybe should be a lot longer, and perhaps the rights should be much stronger. The concessions have, you know, been very busy, of course, managing their forests, but much of their time over the past 20 and 25 years has been defending those concession rights. So it's really critical that in these models that rights are actually secure, that allow communities to do their job to manage the forest and not have to be defending themselves constantly from external pressures.
So a generational length, essentially.
Yes, general duration of rights, but also strength of rights, so that they can have security that their investments today will be reaped by future generations.
It's interesting. I don't want to keep coming back to the Adirondacks, but this is a unique situation in that half the land is state-owned, and the majority of that is what's called forever wild. It's actually in the New York State Constitution, which means you can't do anything. So when the government gets land that was once owned by private individuals, if there's a building there, it can't be taken down. It just collapses and disappears. There's no logging on these forever wild lands, which creates a lot of friction in the community because they see this as a lost opportunity for some economic activity. So it's a really unique situation in that sense that doesn't apply in some regards to there. But on the other hand, it's a pretty steady playing field, because this isn't a 25-year process, a 10-year or 50-year process. This land is this land. It's in this state and will always remain this way. So that removes that difficulty you're talking about that always defending, always coming up with trying to find an argument to continue a process in that sense. Okay, so why don't we go to our next question? This is from Andrew White, a freelance science journalist based in Colombia. There is an expanding body of knowledge in the scientific literature about the effectiveness of concessions in Peten in lowering rates of deforestation and narco ranching, what we've been talking about. Are any of the panelists aware of studies showing the effectiveness of ecotourism ventures built on the model that Mr. Hansen is proposing? Why don't we answer that, then I'll ask the extension to that. So is there anything, and that's a good question, is there research that's been done to show the effectiveness of the model that he is proposing?
I can answer to that. I've looked at this, and there has been no specific information provided with this law proposal that was presented to the United States. And I think, as Ileana mentioned, has not been presented to the Guatemalan government for evaluation. And so we're really only basing ourselves in what has been shared with the media. And this is an idea that has been floating around that the Hansen and his supporters have promoted for the last 20 years. And it involves a miniature train and building hotels within the most protected sanctuaries of the biosphere, including Mirador, and this very remote area close to the border with Mexico. It also includes a section, about half of the area they like to set aside for this is in Mexico. And Mexico has not had a chance to see this either before it goes to the US Congress. And so what we know is that there will be hotels and there will be a miniature train, and there will be a larger number of tourists than what the sites see today, which is a very small number. I think it's about 1,000 a year for Mirador. And also we know that there is an intention, at least, to multiply this number to generate twice the amount of income as what is being generated now by Tikal, which I mentioned is the most visited site in Peten. This is all like statements that have been shared. There's nothing written, but so the idea that we have twice as many tourists at Mirador than what we see at Tikal will be against every rule and regulation of conservation law that exists in Guatemala that would have to be changed, and in the opinion of many, would be disastrous to the wildlife and the forest conservation as a whole. And so, in terms of ecotourism, there are many examples of ecotourism in Guatemala, but typically these are operations that are run by outside investors. And as I mentioned, the local community only get a trickle of the economic benefit in cheap labor, tour guides, which are probably more paid than the other workers in that industry, drivers, cooks, and so forth.
Mirador, the other sites, how fragile are they? I mean, there's the saying, love something to death. How fragile are they? I don't know their condition at this point, and how much of a load of tourism they could support, given what level of restoration they may or may not be in. Francisco?
So in the case of Mirador, there's been 40 years of investigation and conservation, but it's a very remote site. You can only get there by helicopter or on foot, 2-day hike. And so the amount of work that has been done there, because of just the remoteness, is relatively little compared to some of the more accessible sites that are closer to populated places and highways. And so there really isn't that much to see there other than 3 or 4 restored pyramids, and just it's a very large site that is completely covered by the forest otherwise. And one of the attractions is to climb the tallest pyramid and watch the sunset. And the top of the pyramid can only have enough space for about 20 people. And so there's a steady stream of tourists going in already that it pretty much maxed out the capacity of those areas that have been open to tourism. So the idea that we're going to have thousands of people going in per year at the site where only 30 people can fit on top of the pyramid just doesn't make very much sense.
Okay, let's go to our next question if we could. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't finish that one. So the question of research and the effectiveness of ecotourism, and more broadly, is it rare to find papers comparing outcomes from different models of ecotourism? I guess that would make sense. Are any of you aware of any papers that that do sort of an analysis, a comparison between different models of ecotourism? And thinking of, for instance, Borobudur on Java in Indonesia is a very large site and has a lot of space for people to walk around it without actually going up onto the facility itself. There are different models. Are you aware of any research that compares them?
I'm not aware of specific studies that have been done in this area. I've been an archaeologist, so I all my life, so I've seen what happens to archaeological sites when they're open to mass tourism. And so, just one example is where, in northern Yucatan, you have, mass development and tourist influx at places like Tulum and Chichen Itza that get 2 million tourists a year. The economic impact on the local community is not very good. The local communities around those sites don't really get any benefits from all these tourists. All the money goes to the cruise ships, the big hotels, and the companies that are based outside of the area. And the area is completely flooded with tourists. And the local people sell trinkets in the local market outside and sometimes even inside the site. So in terms of the conservation, it's just it's quite the opposite of ecotourism, and so that's definitely a model we don't want. There are better examples of low impact tourism in Guatemala. For example, the site of Yasha that is perhaps the second most visited. It's been run by local communities as well as the government in terms of managing the entrance fees and tourist operations. In part are managed by the local community. So that's a more successful model where we can see that the profits are stayed, at least get to stay in some way with the local communities, more so than places like Tikal or some of the larger sites.
Andrew, you may not have read the legislation enough to know this, but I'm curious, is there any money included in that proposal for restoration and preservation of the site, or is it all focused on getting this operation up and running?
Yeah, so the law, as it is written, is about 3 pages and doesn't give any specifics. There have been other documents by this LLC that appears to be behind this law proposal called the Maya Conservation Partnership, and they detail that a portion of these $12 million that will be given by the U.S. government to for this program, a lot of those will go to conservation and restoration of the pyramids. We just don't know in what proportion. Some of that money is supposed to also go to the government to effectively provide security for this tourist operation. And so we don't know what that means, but presumably more police and more military presence in the area, which is another issue that it's not very good.
And a reminder to the journalists who are watching to be sure and check the chat line. Those who are watching live, Beth just put an article up there that discusses this particular issue. So our next question comes from Hilary Beaumont, a freelance journalist, and I think we've covered most of this, but Andrew, if you want to respond, how exactly would this bill undermine the local efforts that the land concessions already in place?
Sure. So this bill is proposing a reorganization of the management zones of the Maya Biosphere Reserve. It actually doesn't have many specifics. That's kind of the scary part, because building those arrangements inside protected areas and tropical forests are very difficult to build, and the community concessions came out of a very long and long process of negotiation. So interrupting that or toppling the apple cart, so to speak, is not advisable. But again, it doesn't have a lot of specifics. It's just proposing a reorganization of the zones. What the park proponents are saying is that they would not allow forest management by the communities, which is essentially pulling the rug out from under these communities, because forest management is their main economic activity. So if you take that out of the picture, you really take away their livelihoods. You take away the viability of them living and protecting the forests.
Can you give a picture of what forest management looks like? So when you talk about sustainable forest management, I think some people may not understand, and that has a different definition depending on where you are as well. So what does it mean in this context to have sustainable forestry management?
Yes, great point. So what sustainable forest management entails is a strong scientific understanding of the growth rate of all the different species in the forest. And based on that growth rate and the ecosystem and how all of the different elements inside the forest interact, you build a management plan. And that management plan inside these community concessions will slate a very small number of trees to be felled and then restored after they are cut down. The management plan is managed with the Guatemalan government, with the National Commission on Protected Areas, and approved by the Forest Stewardship Council. The community concessions, the main timber species that they manage is actually mahogany. There's a recent scientific study that came out in 2016 that actually said that the community forests were actually one of the best examples of mahogany management in the entire world, not just for community management, but across all management regimes. So what the communities do is they build these management plans which are based on the ecosystem and the growth rate of the species. That's integrated into their business plans. They're able to take that wood, process it, sell it to both national and international markets, and that provides their livelihoods.
So this is, I think that some people, when they think of managed, at least in the U.S., they think of clear cutting a hectare, replanting, letting it come up, go to another area, and we're talking selective trees being pulled out, not an area being leveled.
That's exactly right. So when you walk into the forest is completely dense. I believe the rate is 1 tree per hectare. I'm not sure if Ileana or perhaps one of you might know the exact management point on that. But yes, it's a low intensity management. So you walk into the forest and it's not evident that there has been any cutting at all. The structure and composition of the forest are completely intact. You walk into the forest and it's like walking into any other natural forest. So it is very much taking into account the natural structure and composition of the local ecosystem.
If I may,
I'm sorry, please, yes, please.
Sorry, if I just may add, I mean, just to give you an idea of what this means, it means that the communities are allowed, when we talk about timber, which is not the only thing they're cut, it's just about 1 tree per hectare. So the one that it's allowed, and this is being reviewed and this is being done, that they specify specific areas that, so communities are not allowed to come back to the same area to manage the area in 25 years. So this means that you're allowing for regeneration. There's a lot of data in terms of, in terms of the very low environmental impacts this has, just to add that.
Well, and this is important. Please, yes, of course.
And also in terms of the archaeological sites, there are specific rules that prohibit cutting trees near archaeological sites. And the buffer around them varies in terms of the site size. But so they've been very good at, staying away from the archaeological site. So the idea that, this somehow damages the archaeological site is completely false.
And I wanted to push this because it's important. There's a great deal of ecological research around edge forests, about places with clearings. There are some animals, some birds, some other species, ground-dwelling species that won't cross even a fire road. So you're fracturing habitat if you have these segments, which means that you're reducing the ability for these populations to regenerate. So there's a lot of research that supports this kind of management. So I wanted to be clear about exactly how they're managing this forest in that regard. And Ileana, I think you referenced this. It's more than just timber. There's also some foodstuffs and other things that are coming out. Could you talk about that briefly?
Yes, I mean, in terms of what has commercial value, it's mainly timber, but also other non-timber forest products. This could be like shate leaves, some that you use for floral, for flower arrangements, which are actually used a lot in churches. Or, like allspice, it's pepper, and also sweet gum. It's the material that we use for tires that is also being commercialized. This is what has commercial value. But there's also a lot of materials and products that are used by the communities locally in terms of medicinal plants, in terms of, mushrooms and other food species that are used for, securing food security at the community level, which is actually key in the moments of COVID. And there was a question around that, that I just wanted to make sure that I attached, in particular in these times of COVID, where a lot of these commercial aspects of the forest management are being affected because we have foreign trade restrictions on foreign trade, especially on timber, but also a loss of sales that have affected the commercial of non-timber forest products, which actually there's a lot of management from the women, from the local women. The fact that you have the permission and the right to go to the forest and obtain, like some food from the forest, and because these are not agricultural communities, there's there's no agriculture plots in these areas. Very few are allowed to have those. So having the ability of going to the forest and be able to do that in a organized way, collectively, it's actually securing these communities for having a larger toll on the families by COVID. So this has been key.
And that's a good question too. What is the footprint of these communities, and are more people coming in? If this is a thriving community and doing well, are more people coming in, and does it risk overpopulating? This area can only support so many. So is that a difficulty? So the footprint of the communities and any risk at additional migration and overpopulation.
In terms of the footprint, I mean, there are very strong restrictions on these areas. As Andrew mentioned, these are certified. This means that every year communities and concession areas are being monitored in terms of the type of impact they have on the forests, to make sure that the plan managements are being followed. They also follow national operational plans, very careful, which are not only monitored by the national government, but also by external actor, the FSC. So this is quite important. In terms of agricultural areas, these are allowed, and they're very low scale, especially for those communities that are actually living inside the concession areas, which is 3 of the 9 that are active. And, like in terms of people coming out from elsewhere to these areas, it's prohibited. And actually that 500,000 that I was sharing with you earlier is not only to manage fire, but also to protect the borders of these areas to ensure that no trespassers come. And these communities have actually bring into the government illegal loggers and also other illegal actors that have actually meant in practice that some of these community peoples have been persecuted, and even some have died in terms of protecting their own communities and these forests. So this is a very high stake. And just, if you allow me to reply very quickly to Lorena Arroyo's question on migration. This is a very important question, Lorena. Thank you for asking it. We know, like from government data, and this is very important for you to know, Peten is a frontier region. There's
Well,
30,
the question is about the percentage of population in the Peten
Yeah.
region that have migrated to the U.S. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we know that a lot of the people are coming from elsewhere. The percentage and the proportion of the people, we know from government data that only that in the Peten region as a whole, 8% of the population are migrating outside of Peten. Of those, 7% of the proportion in the Peten region receive remittances. This is very important if you compare that to what's going on in community concessions, where the proportion of people that are families that are receiving remittances is low. It's only 2%.
Remittances from the other countries coming back?
Yeah. So there's a huge there's a difference between, the large Peten area and these communities.
And the suggestion of that being that if they're receiving fewer remittances, it's because they're doing well economically to begin with.
Yeah, I think Beth mentioned, the incentives that come with the rights they receive, the opportunities of employment, the opportunities of receiving benefits, economic benefits, but also, the ability to reinvest, which actually, benefits those that are members of this community forest enterprises, but also those communities that may not be members, but are also benefiting from the social aspects that come with it, health and education mainly.
Okay, so to make clear, what you're saying is that fewer people are migrating out, which indicates success because they've found a life that they can have there, and fewer remittances are coming in because they're doing well. They don't need expatriated members to send them money to support them in what they're doing.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. We're going to go probably a minute or two long, because I have one more question I want to get in from Sofia Menchu with Reuters in Guatemala. Some media in Guatemala have written that this project at El Mirador will become Disneyland because Mr. Hansen doesn't have the permission to make change in the area. Francisco, could you answer that, please? What do you think about that? And
what I think about so like I said, there's been very little specifics that have been shared about exactly how this park project would actually look like. But the little that has been shared directly by Hansen in interviews is that this will be privately managed by a company in Guatemala that is well known for running amusement parks called IRTRA, which is, the equivalent, the Guatemalan equivalent of Disneyland. And he himself has used that expression in those same interviews, saying, we have a real world of Disneyland right here. All we have to do is bring in the people. And so we don't really know whether he means that literally or, but the fact is that this will be managed by private companies, by big corporations, and it will destroy the community-based conservation model that U.S. development agencies have supported with taxpayer money since the 1990s, since the biosphere was created. So that seems to be, a fact.
All right, I want to go to Ileana for some final comments, but first, Beth, I want to come back to the narco issue just very briefly. A quick question about this, because there's still, in some areas, narcos get their way because of violence, because of threats of violence, because of actual violence. Is that a possibility? Is that something? I mean, it's a puzzle to me why this has been controlled so well, with that possibility still existing, I guess. It's a very naive question, and I apologize for that. But can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so narco-traffickers do use violence to get their way. Plata or plomo, as they say, as they've said to park rangers and forest rangers, and also to community members. And we have a lot of illustrative quotes from both community members and forest park managers about incidents of violence that have happened, including in the community forest concessions. So it's not like community forest concessions are immune to the violence that narco traffickers bring 100%. What we do know is that the rates of narco cattle ranching and illegal deforestation that comes along with narco trafficking are not happening in the community forestry concessions. So narco-traffickers, despite their ability to use violence to get their way, are choosing to invest in land for money laundering and for moving supply, mostly outside of community forestry concessions. So there's reasons for that. I mean, it's much, much more difficult or it's much easier, I guess, to threaten or bribe one forest park ranger than it is to do that against an entire community who's invested in the region. So if you just simply think from the narco traffickers' perspective about profits and what's going to be easier, they're going to want to go to the places where they have to use a lot less money and violence to control territory. It's going to be a lot harder to do in forestry concessions. And we've seen that played out in land change patterns on the ground, and we can measure that by satellite. So those are my guesses at some of those mechanisms, and it plays out in the empirical data. Andrew might have some to add here.
Okay. Okay, thank you. One last quick one from Jocelyn Timperley, a freelance journalist. Can we set out the steps ahead for the Senate bill? What the next steps for it in the process, and when it could be passed, and if it's likely that it would be passed? And might the Guatemalan government refuse this money if it's made available? So first of all, just the prospects of the bill. Do we have any ideas there when that might? I don't know if Andrew or Francisco, if you have any thoughts on that, or Ileana.
I think the last I've heard is that the bill has been revised and is still in the Foreign Relations Committee. And because of the situation in Congress right now, it's not clear whether it's going to be moved into the floor of the Senate before the elections. And if that doesn't happen, it's much less likely to be discussed in the Senate during the lame duck session after the elections. And if that doesn't happen, it's going to die, and it's in the new administration, it's going to have to be redrafted and resubmitted.
And given the August recess that should be happening anytime soon, the likelihood of before the elections is probably, I would guess, probably small.
So
okay,
there's a window between the end of the August recess and the elections.
Right, but then they're all politicking, so that's a time when things, they might sneak things through, but that's a time when a lot of legislation actually slows down. All right, so we've talked a great deal about the science, and we're going to wrap this up here. But Ileana, as a native Guatemalan, I'd like to leave you with a few last words with some personal thoughts, if you could, about all this.
Thank you, Dale, and thank you, everybody, for being with us today. Well, for me, as a Guatemalan, I'm actually quite proud of being able to talk about this case, to talk about this model. As you know, Guatemala has come out from a 36 civil war, which actually shows how difficult it is for Guatemalans, to come from a joint perspective, and especially in terms of a conflictive area with so many interests. But actually, this model has allowed to build on a common share of values that bring economic benefits, and also the ability to benefit and to collaborate together, bringing the private sector, bringing the government, and bringing in the local communities. This has taken us 20 years and has informed several countries, as other colleagues have mentioned. So I think it's very important for us, for Guatemalans. I've actually been, it's quite exciting to see how in Guatemala more interest is coming. It's emerging from other Guatemalans to learn about this case and also to defend it because of what it means. It's not only about the environmental value that the Mayan biosphere has as a protected area. It's about building common values that brings together very different perspectives towards a common goal. So thank you.
Thank you. And thank all of you for joining us today. A quick process note for journalists. A video of this webinar will be posted in the next few days at the Earth Institute blog called State of the Planet. The address for that is blogs.ei.columbia.edu. Along with the video, I will include a blog post, and there will be links to resources along with story ideas that you as journalists can use to begin your coverage of this issue. I hope you'll check it out and also look at the other videos that make up the Resilience Media Project. The Resilience Media Project is a part of Andy Revkin's new initiative at the Earth Institute, which includes Sustain What? Sustain What is a global conversation focused on identifying concrete solutions to the complicated challenges of humanity today. Our primary focus is on making sense of the changes impacting our Earth and biological systems. In light of the outbreak of COVID-19, the main focus of our sessions is on mitigating the unfolding societal disruption and devastation driven by this pandemic, and teaching journalists how to better respond to these issues. At the same time, we're also focusing on ways to build more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable communities in the years ahead. You can check out Andy's program as well as mine at the Earth Institute website. My thanks to all our guests, Francisco, Andrew, Beth, and Ileana, and to you for joining us. I look forward to seeing you all again at a future program, and thank you for joining this briefing. Bye-bye.